Have you ever wondered what happens when the line between life and death fades away irreversibly? Imagine a place where shadows come to life and the dead find no rest. In today's video, we will venture into the heart of a morgue, where something far beyond death lurks in the shadows. Here, bodies are not just bodies, but witnesses to an eternal suffering that refuses to vanish. With every step, the feeling that we are not alone intensifies, and what begins as a simple cataloging task transforms into a nightmare. Pay close attention to every detail, because what you will see may not just be a horror story, it's an invitation to question what lies hidden in the depths of the unknown. Don't forget to leave a like and stay until the end. But before we continue, let me ask, what if the dead could really communicate? What would they be trying to tell us?
It was a moonless night, cold and dense when the gates of the morgue closed behind me. Silence was everywhere, a muffled stillness, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Inside, the concrete and steel corridors echoed with the heavy steps of the dead, now resting in their metal coffins, waiting for an eternal rest that it seemed would never come. The smell of formaldehyde permeated the air, making each breath harder to take. The biting cold made my bones ache and my fingers curl involuntarily. The dim light from the lamps hanging from the ceiling cast long, twisted shadows on the walls. Every corner seemed to hide a secret, every space between the bodies a story left untold. I knew I wasn't alone, but the feeling of being watched by empty eyes was almost unbearable. The coffins lined up, like soldiers at rest, held the echo of laments from past lives. Some figures seemed familiar, others strange, but all shared a common fate, the eternal wait. With every step I took, the metallic sound of my shoes on the floor reverberated as though the building itself was protesting my presence. Suddenly, a creaking door opened in the distance, and I found myself before a larger, darker room. Inside, one coffin stood out from the others. It lacked the cold gleam of metal, instead made of dark, polished wood, as if it had been carefully chosen. There was no plaque, no identification. A shiver ran down my spine. The feeling that something more was there waiting was palpable. Before I could approach, the sound of wind howling through the crack in the window seemed to pull me back. Something was about to happen. And in the morgue, when the silence becomes too heavy, it's a sign that the answers are never simple or even human. The morgue was a place where time dragged on, as if the shadows on the walls had a life of their own. At every corner, a sense of suffocation made itself known, an invisible pressure that squeezed my chest and made every breath an effort. The smell of formaldehyde and moisture invaded my nostrils, mixing with the heavy air of those who had once lived, and who, now in their death, still seemed to want to make themselves noticed. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting dark, trembling lights over the bodies lying on metal shelves. Each one seemed to have a story that would never be told, an interrupted life that refused to be forgotten. The sound of footsteps on the concrete echoed down the hallway, like a distant whisper, a murmur that didn't come from anyone in particular, but from the very atmosphere of the place, as if the morgue had become a living organism, breathing slowly and consuming the space around it. The shelves stretched out like the shelves of an old book, with names and numbers engraved on metal plates, cold and impersonal. But for those who observed closely, there was something more, a gaze perhaps fixed and empty, hovering over the pale lines of the faces that remained. The weight of death seemed to seep into the walls, every crack a story, every stain of mold a memory of what had once been. It was impossible not to feel the presence of something invisible and intimate there, something that persisted, even after the flesh and blood had faded. The morgue, with its stagnant air and shadows that danced silently, held not just bodies, but also echoes of life. And in the midst of the oppressive silence, the thought that these souls still awaited something, perhaps recognition, perhaps rest, seemed to linger in the air, like a ghostly presence that refused to dissipate. I knew my task was simple, to catalogue the bodies. It wasn't the first time I had been there, and most of the time the work was methodical and uneventful. But that night, something was different. A palpable energy lingered in the atmosphere, something I couldn't understand, but that enveloped me in a way that disconcerting. The place, usually cold and impersonal, now seemed to feed on something, as if the dead there were not so dead. The bodies lined up on the metal shelves felt closer than ever. I tried to keep my focus, writing down the numbers and names in my notebook, but a strange sense of surveillance began to seep into my mind. The concrete walls with their cracks and mold stains seemed to lean toward me as if they were watching every move, absorbing my presence. The heat from the lamp above me pulsed, causing the light to tremble, casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. The dark figures danced around me, contorting and elongating as if they wanted to frighten me, or perhaps trap me there. I looked at them, trying to ignore the growing discomfort, but the shadows seemed to draw nearer, becoming sharper, more real. With every step I took through the corridors, the air grew heavier, warmer, as if the building itself was breathing in unison with me, trying to swallow me whole. The whispers I heard weren't human sounds, but something deeper, coming from the very depths of those cold rooms. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I felt a growing presence, a silent force, watching me without words. As I jotted down another name, something caught my attention, a body out of place. It wasn't on a shelf, but leaning against the wall, positioned in a way that seemed deliberate, almost provocative. When I approached to investigate, the lamp above me flickered, sending one last burst of light, and I saw what I feared. It wasn't just the body, but the sense that it was still there, waiting for something I could no longer ignore. As I began to examine the first body, a light breeze swept through the room, something unusual in that closed, stuffy place. For a moment I swore I heard a whisper, a soft sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the nearby tombs, but there was no one there. The air was thick, unchanging, and the only thing breaking the silence was the sound of my nervous breaths, trying to remain steady. My fingers, cold with tension, touched the corpse's cold surface. The metal of the coffin felt undisturbed, as always, but instead of just feeling the hardness and weight of the structure, something different happened. A strange vibration ran through my hands, a sensation that couldn't be explained. It was as if the coffin was pulsating, as if, for a moment, there were life within it. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine, forcing me to pull my hands away for a moment. I lifted my gaze, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Everything seemed normal. The metal shelves, the bodies, the dim lights from the lamps, everything was in its usual place, but something was wrong. The shadows on the walls seemed deeper, denser, as if they were moving slowly, twisting in directions that defied logic. The feeling that something was moving there, in the darkness, grew stronger with each passing second. It was as if I was being watched by invisible eyes, and I couldn't tell if it was the dead themselves watching me, or something else, something ancient, inhabiting the very morgue. I tried to return to my task, but the sense of unease was overwhelming. The shadows on the walls, now more restless, seemed to stretch and shrink as if preparing for something. The air was dense, filled with an expectation I couldn't explain, as if the place was waiting, anticipating something I couldn't understand but could feel, like a growing pressure on my chest. With visible effort, I returned to touching the coffin, trying to push away the disturbing images that filled my mind, but the vibration was still there, stronger now. I knew that somewhere deep within that place, something was beginning to wake up. The morgue, with its dark, cold walls, seemed to have absorbed all the tragedies that had occurred there. The air was thick with a dense sadness, as if the very environment was a reflection of the lives that had passed through that place. Each breath blended with the acrid smell of formaldehyde and the humidity that hung like an invisible mist. The weak lamps flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls, creating distorted, unsettling shapes. With every movement I made, the echoes of something or someone seemed to follow me. They weren't clear sounds, but the sensation was unmistakable. Footsteps overlapping mine, muffled sighs lost in the walls, as if the dead present were still trying to communicate. The stillness of the morgue was disturbing, but what truly unsettled me wasn't the sounds or the whispers I could almost hear. It was the strange sensation that I wasn't alone. I looked at the bodies lined up on the shelves, their pale, expressionless faces. But somewhere between the light and the darkness, I felt a presence. Something or someone was there, watching me, waiting. The cold of the place seemed to penetrate deeper, as if the building itself were alive, breathing slowly around me. With every step I took, the sound of my own feet on the concrete seemed to be muffled by another layer, deeper, older, and no matter how hard I tried to push the feeling away, it persisted, growing stronger. I tried to focus on the task at hand, cataloging the bodies, writing down the details I needed, but the unease wouldn't disappear. The movement of the shadows around me was like an invitation, a distant call I couldn't ignore. With each shelf I passed, It felt like something was moving in the shadows, some shapeless form, just a reflection of what I feared most. The idea that inside that place something was still very much alive. That's when a lamp above me flickered and a cold shiver ran down my spine. There was no longer any doubt. I wasn't alone. As I wrote down the details of a new body, the light in the room flickered. For a moment everything went dark and the cold in the room increased almost instantly, as if the very environment was swallowing the light and warmth. I paused for a moment, waiting for the light to return, but nothing happened. The air was dense, heavy, and an uncomfortable sensation crawled across my skin, as if the whole place were watching, waiting for something. Then I heard it. A low laugh, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to crawl along the morgue's walls. It came from the back of the room where the bodies were stored. At first, I thought it was the product of my tired mind, maybe the echo of a sound I hadn't noticed before. But the laugh persisted, crawling as if something was amused by my presence. The sound reverberated in a macabre way, as if it were made to provoke. I felt a cold chill rise up my spine, as if a thread of ice had been shoved into my veins. I tried to rationalize it. It couldn't be anything. The morgue was empty, there was no one else there but me, or so I thought. But the laugh crawled on, muffled and torturous, echoing in every dark corner, almost like a background song that didn't want to be heard, but demanded to be. It was a laugh that wasn't human. It was a dissonant sound, one that didn't belong in that place but still made itself known, as if the place itself had come alive, or perhaps was inhabited by something that fed on my fear. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to push away the panic starting to seep into my thoughts. But when I opened them again, the air was even colder, was human. It was a strange, muffled cry, trapped within me, lost in the suffocating air. I tried to step away, but my body felt frozen, as if it were being held by invisible chains. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. The hand, cold, more so than any ice, lingered for a moment. Then slowly, it withdrew. But the presence remained palpable, a suffocating weight in the room. I was no longer alone in the morgue. Something had crossed the boundary between life and death, and now it was here, with me, in the darkness. I didn't dare to turn around, fearing what I might see. I wanted to run, to escape, but the door was behind me, already closing, sealing me in. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, pressing in from all sides. The cold intensified, not just in the room but within me, as if the touch of death itself had claimed a part of me. I could feel the eyes of the bodies on me. It wasn't just the shadows stretching and contorting into unnatural shapes, no, it was their eyes, empty and lifeless, yet somehow filled with a silent accusation. The walls seemed to pulse, and the space felt alive, suffocating with a hunger I could not comprehend. I stepped back, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The air was thick, almost solid, and the whispers began. Low at first, a barely audible murmur, but then it grew louder, closer. It felt as if the very walls were speaking, communicating something I could not understand, something dark, something ancient. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the stifling silence, consumed by the shadows, the weight of the morgue pressing in on me. I couldn't breathe. The cold was all-encompassing, and the oppressive presence was overwhelming. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It had become a force, alive, seeking something or someone. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of something moving, the unmistakable creak of a coffin lid shifting, the groan of something stirring from within. My pulse quickened, my eyes darting across the room. Every corner, every inch of space felt alive with hidden movement, as if the dead were waking, moving, waiting. I couldn't bear it any longer. I tried to turn and run, but it was no use. The shadows were everywhere, thick and heavy, closing in on me. I stumbled forward, only to find myself surrounded, trapped by an unseen force, pulling me deeper into the heart of the morgue. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and the strange, suffocating presence of something that should not be. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as I struggled to take in air, but it was like breathing through water. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I realized too late that I had become part of this place, this dark, cursed space where the dead still lingered, waiting. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, but it was not the same silence I had known before. It was thick, suffocating, as if the very air had turned against me. I could feel it, a presence, pressing in from every side, consuming me. The last thing I saw before the darkness overtook me was the faint outline of a figure standing by the far wall, motionless, watching. And I knew, in that final moment, that the dead had not been waiting for me to leave. They had been waiting for me to stay. It passed through my own ears, muffled, trapped, locked inside me, as if the air around me was becoming thicker, denser. I tried to move, but my feet were paralyzed, as if an invisible force had nailed them to the ground. Every fiber of my being begged me to flee, to run, but panic consumed me, and I could do nothing. The feeling that something was rising from the ground took hold of me with a silent violence, a growing pressure that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. I looked down, but all I saw was the cold, stained concrete, as if the morgue itself was opening, as if the foundations of the place were being torn apart, revealing something I shouldn't see. The air was colder now, heavier. The shadows on the walls began to stretch unnaturally, almost as if they were twisting, searching for something or someone in a slow, threatening movement. A sharp pain, like needles, began to travel up my spine, and I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was no longer alone. I was no longer in control. Something had awakened, something that didn't belong to this world. My breathing became faster, irregular, but I was still paralyzed. The cold hand withdrew from my neck, but the sense of presence remained stronger, more threatening. I wanted to scream, but my throat was closed, as if the place itself had swallowed my words, preventing me from asking for help. I was surrounded, trapped, and somewhere deep in the morgue something was approaching, waiting, and I knew that at any moment, whatever was being released from the ground would no longer have patience. The morgue, with its aging structure and cold walls, had become a labyrinth of nightmares. The place, which had once seemed like just a warehouse of death, now exuded something much more sinister. The shadows, which had previously been mere reflections of the weak light from the flickering lamps, now took grotesque forms. They stretched along the walls, twisting and extending into indistinct shapes that seemed to crawl, as if they were alive, watching my every movement with a deadly attention. It was no longer the morgue's silence that bothered me. It was the palpable fear, as if every corner hid a macabre secret, waiting to be revealed. The feeling of being followed, which had once been only a premonition, now became an excruciating certainty. I could feel the eyes of the shadows on me, as if something was watching me, waiting for the exact moment to act. With every step I took, the air grew denser, heavier. The biting cold of the walls seemed to invade my skin, freezing my blood, making my body shiver involuntarily. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing there, that it was just the exhaustion and fear playing tricks on me, but I couldn't. Something was there. Something wanted to see me paralyzed, to make me succumb to terror. The sound of my footsteps on the concrete now sounded muffled, as if the ground itself were trying to swallow me. I looked at the bodies lined up on the shelves, and for a moment I thought I saw their eyes move, as if something inside them had awakened. Formaldehyde was no longer the only scent in the air. There was something else, a sour, old fragrance, emanating from the shadows that crawled around me. I knew I wasn't alone, but I couldn't see who or what was surrounding me. The darkness had become a prison, an invisible trap tightening around me. I knew with a desperate clarity that there was something, someone that didn't want me to leave there alive. Perhaps it was the place itself, fed by an ancient evil that never rested, or perhaps it was something much older and much more sinister, waiting patiently, watching. The exit door seemed so far away, as if the corridor leading to freedom had stretched infinitely, defying every attempt to escape. With every movement, the shadows closed in around me, becoming denser, more oppressive. And then, a muffled laugh echoed in the walls, low, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me stop. I knew that somewhere in the darkness, something was smiling. The bodies around me seemed to be in a state of eternal agony, their faces contorted in expressions of immortal pain, as if somehow still aware of their death. Those disfigured faces seemed to beg for a rest that would never come, an endless torment etched into every line of their pale countenances. The air was heavy, charged with a suffocating energy, as if the morgue itself were holding on to the last breaths of those who lay there. With every step I took, the silence seemed to grow more oppressive, as if the dead themselves were watching, attentive to every movement I made. I could feel their invisible gazes on me, a growing pressure that made my body tremble. It was as if I were in a place where time didn't pass, where the dead didn't rest, but dragged themselves slowly through eternity. It was then, when I looked back, that something cold ran down my spine. A hooded figure, mostly hidden by the shadows, was there, motionless, staring at me with a deep, empty, lifeless gaze. Its eyes were dark abysses, as if there were nothing but an immense void there. The figure didn't move, but its presence was so dense, so threatening that it almost seemed to consume me. I knew I shouldn't be seeing it, that it shouldn't be there, but even so, I couldn't look away. In the midst of the mortal stillness of the morgue, a scream, or perhaps it was more of a pressure, pierced my being. It was a sound that couldn't be heard, but could be felt, like an unbearable weight in the air, something muffled and desperate. It was as if the bodies in their suffering were trying to warn me, trying to tell me something I couldn't understand, a warning that hovered over me, but that, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't grasp. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the hooded figure now seemed closer, as if it were waiting for something, as if it were observing me, evaluating what I would do next. The cold in the air increased and the space around me seemed to narrow. I knew I was no longer safe, that something was happening there, something beyond what I could control or understand, and deep down, I knew that this muffled scream was only the beginning of something even more terrible to come. My steps grew heavier, as if the ground itself were resisting my movement, and the air, dense and suffocating, seemed to swallow every breath. With every step I took, it became thicker, as if the morgue itself were draining my energy, slowly draining me. The shadows around me began to spread, crawling along the walls and the concrete floor, stretching unnaturally, as if they had a life of their own, and wanted to swallow me whole. I could feel their invisible claws trying to envelop me, pulling me into an abyss I didn't want to understand, but that felt more and more real. I tried to walk toward the exit, but the walls seemed to close in, distorting my perception of space. The line between nightmare and reality blurred, mixing in an unsustainable way. I could no longer tell where terror began and where my mind ended. Every shadow, every breath in the air, every low sound that slithered through the cracks of the morgue made me doubt the sanity that still remained within me. I no longer knew what was real. I no longer knew if that place truly existed, or if everything I felt was a distortion caused by fear. And with each passing second, a terrifying truth settled in my mind. I became more certain that somehow the morgue was not just a place of death. It was not merely where the bodies rested, forgotten by time. No, there was something more there. Something I wasn't prepared to comprehend. It was a place where the dead still had something to say, something they couldn't leave behind. And as I got lost in that labyrinth of concrete and shadows, I knew that the voice they were trying to convey to me would not be something simple, nor easy to hear. Each body I passed seemed to watch me, not with eyes, but with souls, as if they were begging to be heard, as if somehow their stories were still trapped in that space, waiting for someone to finally understand them. I wasn't just being watched, I was being called. And as the shadows stretched further around me, I knew that the morgue's deadly silence was about to be broken, and that the truth I sought was something I could not ignore, even if it meant facing something much greater than any death I had ever seen. The sound of something dragging behind me was enough to freeze my body. It was a low sound, almost imperceptible, but intense enough to slice through the absolute silence that dominated the morgue. A scratching, a sliding, as if something was slowly moving over the cold floor. My heart raced and tension spread through every muscle in my body. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed to know what was behind me. Reluctantly, I turned quickly, my eyes desperately searching for an explanation. But when I did, there was no one there. Nothing but more shadows stretching along the walls, taking distorted shapes as if they were an extension of the very fear that consumed me. The silence returned, heavy, deafening. The air seemed denser, as if each second was compressing me more, making me more vulnerable. I looked around, searching for something, anything that could justify what I had just heard. But the morgue was empty, its hallways vacant and silent as always. Yet there was a strange feeling, something almost imperceptible, that told me I was no longer alone. Something was hiding there, in those shadows, waiting. It wasn't a physical being, something I could see or touch. It was a presence, a threatening sensation that hung in the air, as if the place itself were breathing with a life of its own, nourished by the suffering of those who had departed. The feeling of being watched was inescapable. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but my legs were paralyzed, rooted to the cold floor. I knew there was no escape. The fate was there, inevitable, pressing me forward, driving me deeper into the darkness. There was no way to escape that weight, no way to avoid what was about to happen. The thought that the morgue was not just a tomb, but a place where time and space distorted, consumed me from within. As the silence stretched around me, I realized, with a chilling clarity, that the true terror was not in what I could see, but in what I could not. And the sensation that something awaited me in the shadows was more terrifying than anything my eyes could comprehend. The fate, that silent and inexorable fate, was approaching, and I knew deep down that nothing could save me from it.
Thank you for watching until the end. If the video intrigued you, share it with your friends. Who knows? Maybe they'll get scared and get involved in this unique experience too. Don't forget to check out the next video that will appear on the screen. See you there.